Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm here with Renata Leo, the multipassionate startup generalist, co-host of the podcast Overrated / Underrated, creator of the pure human content, as well as co-blogger for BuffaloSauceEverywhere.com. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Justin. I'm really excited. I know we discovered each other a while ago, and I'm excited to finally do a thing. This is going to be great.
Yeah, finally get to collaborate. So This is a podcast for people who are more innovative and more polymathic. So can you say hello to the innovators in the audience?
Hello, innovators in the audience.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast. Well, and it's interesting too because this is also the first interview I've done basically all year. So thank you for getting me to get back on track on that.
Yeah, I'm good like that, you know. Very helpful.
Yeah. Speaking of what you're good at, share something about yourself that no one knows about you. It's the way I like to break the ice. No one, or it's close to it.
I was going to say, it's very challenging. I'm an extrovert. I talk to all my friends about everything, which I guess is a fun fact. Anytime I go to make a decision, because I'm very bad at decisions, there's like a panel of 5 people that I run everything by.
So what was like the last decision you had to make that you had to like access the panel for?
Oh, geez. So actually, and this is one of the things I know we were thinking about talking about, I'm considering getting my yoga teacher certification. So I went to all the people that know me best, and I'm like, does this sound like something that's on track? Would I be living my truth if I do this? So I had to go and make sure with the panel that it made sense.
I mean, I only know you from online and the research that I did for the interview too, but I honestly think that would be good for you as well.
Right, right, probably, yeah.
So getting into the questions here, what was your mindset 5 years ago and how have you changed since then?
So my mindset 5 years ago, in all honesty, it was just kind of figuring out exactly what I wanted to do. 5 years ago, I probably still wanted to go into student affairs. That was a big thing for me coming out of college. And I think that's part of the hard part, right? Like 5 years ago for me was not right out of college, but a couple years out of college. And it's such a different mindset, I find. End of college, right out of college is a very different mindset than I have now. And it'll be different than I have in another 5 to 10 years. We're in such a pivotal moment right now. Yeah, coming out of college, thinking about going into student affairs, debating that. 5 years ago, I was probably looking into graduate schools. And it's very funny because when I actually interviewed and actually went, I realized I didn't want to go. And that was a huge shift for me. That was really, really big. So compared to where I am right now, being siloed like that would probably freak me out. Going back to school, honestly, on some level, freaks me out. It's interesting because I do find that I'm like more or less embracing the polymathy and generalists like thoughts now, whereas that's not where I was at 5 years ago, for sure. I was that way naturally, but not that way. I wasn't seeking it out, I think.
Well, and I almost wonder too if the societal kind of pressure kind of dampened that mentality as well for you.
For me, I wouldn't call it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be like I am immune to societal pressure. I know that there are a lot of societal pressures that don't penetrate. Right? They don't touch me. I have never really worn makeup. So things like that where I understand that a lot of people feel societal pressure. I don't. I don't, it doesn't bother me so much being bisexual. Like, I totally understand there are people in way worse situations dealing with their sexuality, and I'm able to kind of just say it and shrug and be like, oh, well. So I feel similar about, like, I probably didn't know that being a generalist was a thing. So it was more or less that society has, like, tapped it down to where mainly everyone are specialists. But I wouldn't say that I felt like, oh, no, I have to choose one career path. It was more or less, this is just something that you do. It wasn't like I can't be a bunch of things. It was, I'm just not looking for it at this point.
Yeah, so your mind got opened up to it once you came across the idea then.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nice. And I think too, like, the idea of going to graduate school is always different for a lot of people. Like, some people do it for specialism, some people do it because they want to do more than what they did. They'll go to a graduate school because it's different degree than what their bachelor's might have been. But it's interesting when you choose your own path and you're like, okay, I'm going to start doing whatever I want to do, create content or this particular career field, and you start pushing into that more divergency. You start to get more excited about it seems like.
I would agree with that. I would also say, so coming out of college, I just kind of started at a place where where I had an in, I had connections, so I could start there, and lived, I feel like in most stages of my life, I've lived a generalist life, but I didn't know what that really meant, and I couldn't put a word to it. Like, since college, I've always said, oh, college was the time I was most myself. And when I describe why that is, it is a very generalist mindset. So now that I'm living that life, I'm like, oh, I see where I was already at. I just didn't have a term for it. So similar to that, when I started in my first job out of college and I didn't love what I was doing at that company, I changed jobs 3 times. Like, I literally was like, I can't sit still. Like, can I try something new? Can I try something else? And they liked me enough that they were like, sure, like, you know, we can move you around if that would be easier. So yeah, it's always been, in some way, I've always been living like this. It's just putting a name to it, seeking it out. And even when I moved on from that job, I didn't know what I was looking for. And looking at jobs where I was only doing one thing made me want to cry. It was like, I don't want to do the same thing every day. I can't.
My favorite job experience is when I had 6 different roles at the same company, and I was just getting pulled every which way. It was crazy, but it was engaging.
Yes.
Speaking of school, you majored in neuroscience with a sleep focus, actually. So what made you go into that?
So technically, I majored in neuroscience and French with a minor in mathematics, which once again, generally, and that's, living my best generalist life, right, in college, because I was like, oh, no holds barred, I'm just doing it all. My independent study was in sleep, and it was, how do I put this? It was primarily because I couldn't find anything else really to do. The independent study was the way to get all my credits that made sense without overloading my schedule. And so my advisor said, well, come to me with a list of topics. And for me, primarily, I would have loved to have studied something where there was like a difference in gender. But she was like, look, that's just so tricky. It's so tricky when you go into gender stuff. She's like, for a grad program, sure. For an undergrad, it's just, you're going to bump into too much stuff. So I decided to do my independent study on sleep, mostly because it was like one of the things that interested me most. My problem, and this makes sense, I think, for me as a person, and for me as my future progressed, I was in all these neuroscience classes with people that were like, I want to study cancer, I want to study Alzheimer's, I want to study these big questions. And so, like, in my senior seminar, one of the things we had to do was pick one paper and then essentially present it to the class. And while everyone was doing things like that, Alzheimer's, cancer, whatever, I literally picked a study. I believe it was, does the type of music in a hospital waiting room change the experience of the people in the hospital waiting room? Because I'm like, these are the questions I'm interested in. Like, I'm not interested, well, it's so wrong. Like, you know, I don't want to do these big studies on terrible diseases. I want to do weird studies. I want to know weird things that people are thinking. One of the things I've Googled in my life is, I want to know what happens in the brain that's different when you hear an inside joke, right? Like a very, very personal inside joke with one other person. So I literally, my advice was like, what studies have we gone over that have been particularly interesting to you in class? And I literally just stared at her and I'm like, none of them. They're all these heavy topics that I don't want to talk about. So sleep was just something that I could at least relate to, right? Like, it wasn't something like crazy that I couldn't relate to.
No, and I think you kind of sounded like you almost downplayed it a little bit, like, oh, it's not as big as like Alzheimer's or something like that. But sleep, we do 1/3 of our lives. I literally slept all day yesterday, basically, because I needed to catch up after working Friday and Saturday a ton. Right. I just needed to recuperate, and so I let myself sleep in instead of working on the content yesterday, just because I knew I was going to need that recovery time. And it's just one of those things we don't even know exactly why we need sleep fully. Like, we know we recover from it, but we don't really know why. And it's interesting how, like, a lot of the famous polymaths too had like a polyphasic sleep cycle, and for people like us, it almost seems ethereal. Because like, I've tried polyphasic, and I'm like, I don't know if I could sleep for an hour or so 4 times a day. Like, I don't know if that would really work for me. But like, for them, it worked. And so, like, why did it work, and how did that work? That kind of thing.
Well, and
it's curious.
Yeah, so since then, I mean, I've had an interesting relationship with sleep since then. And it is interesting because until you brought it up, I was like, I don't really think of it, right? It was college, it was a very small part of my college career. It was just my independent study, so it was just senior year. And by senior year, I was considering what I was doing after anyway, right? So those classes are kind of, I don't remember them much anyway. But since then, it's interesting. I had a lot of trouble sleeping a few years post-college, and I couldn't figure out why. And it wasn't until, believe it or not, I got off of prescription contraceptives that I realized that was screwing with my sleep. And it's just a very uncommon side effect, but it's one that really screwed with me. And I'm sure it screws with a lot of people that don't know, that are just on it and have no idea why they're not sleeping. It's
amazing how some of the smallest things like that, like obviously it's not a small thing, but it's a smaller thing that you might not normally consciously think of too. Neuroscience is actually something we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and like I had a guest, Ethan Janney, at one point, and he was talking about neuroscience and music and how like you said, the music in the lobby, and it's kind of fascinating. Like I've always listened to music. Right now I'm listening to binaural beats so I can get into a certain mindset when talking to you, and it's just it's crazy. So all of my life people have told me I should do this, you should do that, and we talked about that a moment ago. Like you said, it doesn't really affect you as much. What is your opinion on this whole should concept?
So actually, one of the chapters of my upcoming book is about kicking shoulds to the curb. I actually think that is the chapter title, is kicking shoulds to the curb, because overall I don't super agree with them. I've always been pretty much you do you as long as you're not hurting yourself or anyone else, right? And in all honesty, there's some amount of self-sabotage that I think we all go through anyway. So yeah, I've never been a huge fan of shoulds, and I'm not going to say that I'm immune to them, but there are some that I feel like people definitely feel super pressured by that just don't really bother me. And I think part of that is coming into your own as an adult as opposed to a teenager. Like, you know how people are like, oh, high school was the prime of my life, or, whatever. And for me, I mean, right now I do feel like it was college, but a lot of the things that a lot of the societal pressures I started bumping into were when I was an adult and had already formed my personality and who I was and recognized who I was as a person. And so once people tried to be like, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and I'm like, why? Like, I don't understand these pressures that people have felt since like childhood, right? Or since puberty or whatever. Like, I also have very feminist parents who never really pushed a lot of things on me. By the time I was 18, my mom was like, oh, I can tell you've never wanted kids. You might never want kids. That's cool. I don't really care. So I think that also is probably part of it, that like, some of the stressors that my parents put on me, yes, definitely are still here. And I recognize they're not logical. But there are a lot of them that I feel like just never really hit me until as an adult people were telling me about these things that were holding them back, these shoulds that were holding them back, and I'm like, oh, that's just do what you want. Why? Why are you doing that? I don't understand.
It's interesting because I think you and I we both are very similar in the nature that we found our own individuation, I think is what the word is, and we've adapted that to our lives. And so when someone tells us should, it doesn't necessarily follow our model that we have of ourselves in our head. And so we might take the idea of it's like a friend saying you should do this or something like that. We might entertain the idea, but then we'll move on past it because it doesn't align with where we're going.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. Or once again, even when they're like, well, I should do this, or should I do this, or whatever, and I'm like, how can I answer that for you? I can't answer that. You right? Like, you tell me what you should do. You. I don't. Not that well.
Yeah. So something we talked about the last time we chatted, it was about discipline, and you said that the word discipline makes your skin crawl. So I was curious about that.
I love that you remember that. I'm like, really? You're like, last time we talked, I'm like, oh my goodness. I'm like, how does he remember last time we talked? I think, so, after working with my dietitian, and this is, honestly, I think this is a generalist thing too. I love to take concepts that I'll learn in one context. That's the word I want. In one context, and apply it elsewhere. So, I have some very bad disordered eating patterns. I have some really, really, I have a really not great relationship with food. And so I started working with an intuitive eating dietitian. Her name's Kelsey. She is very awesome. But one of the things that she kind of talked about was how we shame ourselves a lot around food, and about how that doesn't, and discipline, right, is one of the things we hear come up a lot with food. And it doesn't really work. Doing these very, very strict things with ourselves, it doesn't really work, because what we want to do is rebel against them. That's all that we want. And I think that it's not just with food, right? Like, she's like, oh, there's not, in the intuitive eating space, the whole idea is that we're not going to change ourselves with strict rules and with discipline and with shame, right? All those negative things. The negative reinforcement doesn't work. It's positive reinforcement that works. It's love and appreciation and bodily care that is actually going to get us what we want. So I think that rings true for a lot of things in life. So like, let's say we're talking about motivation, right? So like write a blog post or something. I'm like, look, forcing myself to do this, having discipline and forcing myself to sit down and do this is just not going to cut it. I'm going to wait until I feel like I want to do it, or maybe I'll do it at the end. Or, I mean, at the end of the day, I think my problem is I have pushed myself too far on discipline, and now I need to, what I'm learning now is giving myself grace when things don't go exactly how I had planned initially. And that's almost the opposite of discipline, right? So I have been over-disciplined my entire life through whatever means. Now it's reining it in and learning what the opposite of that is. The problem is sometimes you need to learn the opposite. For me, I need to learn the opposite before I can find center again. So it's kind of working on figuring out exactly where that center is. And I think for me, part of the issue is I don't want to preach discipline in any way, because I feel like people, in my experience, take it too far.
Yeah.
Take it too far in one direction, and the guilt that comes out of that is so much worse than anything else.
It's interesting because as you were speaking, I was trying to make sure I actively listen and not think about what I'm going to say or anything like that. The skill that I had to like work on, it took a lot of discipline, I guess you could say, to do so. But it's just one of those things where a lot of what you said I agreed with, but our pathways to what we discovered, that agreement, like what our hypothesis, like what we discovered, that our ways to do that were divergent. I find that sometimes it's a matter of getting past that plateau. Like, sure, like if you don't feel like doing it, there's some points where you should do it anyways, because it's training a muscle of the brain to do it. But there's also, like you said, that grace, and also having self-empathy too, where if you don't do it, you shouldn't necessarily hound yourself for it. Like I've done that a lot with content over the past few years, where I give myself so much crap for not getting it out at a certain time frame. I've been working on these 20 posts all year that I've been trying to get out, and I keep pushing it back, because I wasn't ready to really get it out yet. And I gave myself crap for it, but I also realized too, it probably wasn't the right time for me to work on that posts. And just having that empathy, I think, for yourself is kind of what you were going for there, it seems like. Yeah,
so it really is finding the balance. And perhaps maybe, so if we're saying that, and I don't think anything is universal, but if for the sake of argument, we're saying that the theory is, once you go too far in one direction, you have to go back in the other direction to find center. Maybe you're just closer to finding center than I am, and I'm still, I'm still in that counter phase. I actually did write about that, though. I've written a post about essentially long-term versus short-term thinking. While on one hand I was like, oh, I'm far too disciplined, I need to kind of go the other direction, where I've realized it's not always helpful to just go completely the other direction. And one of them being depression, where I'm like, ooh, I just want to sit on the couch all day and do nothing. And that ends up making me feel worse, not because I feel guilty for sitting on the couch, but because going out would actually be much more effective. Where, on one hand, my brain is like, what I feel like doing is sitting on the couch. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to discipline myself into going out. However, 6 hours later, I'm going to feel much worse. So it's striking the balance. I find, it's so annoying, because I just want to be a black and white thinker, and everything in life is balance,
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And recently, as I age, as I become mature and very old and close to death, I've been
hey, I'm older than you. Watch it.
I've been talking to people about striking the balance, and I think it is different, because I think this is almost a generational thing. Whereas our parents and grandparents were save for the future, save for the future, save for the future. Where now we're trying to figure out the balance between, saving for the future is pretty important, assuming you're going to have one, which is a good assumption to make. But you also need to remember that I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, right? Like, I need to remember that tomorrow isn't promised. So it's striking a balance between living for today and preparing for the future. And it's finding that middle ground. And that's with everything. That's truly with everything.
And I think food is another good example too. Like, we both have had our own journeys with food. Yours obviously seems like a lot more harder than even mine. And I think a lot of times people misunderstood what I was dealing with. I was trying to gain weight. I was very underweight and that kind of thing. And people are always trying to lose weight. Like, usually when you think of dieting or think of like a lot of weight changes, it's usually from that downwards perspective. And I would tell my people, like my water breath classes, like, hey, I'm having a hard time because I have to teach 13 water whisk classes a week and 8 hours of swim lessons and then 5 hours of my own workout. I'm working out like 30 hours a week. I'm burning off my muscle.
Yeah.
Not fat. I'm burning off muscle. And I think a lot of people just didn't have that empathy. They couldn't put their mind in those shoes. So I was constantly overfeeding myself to compensate for all the exercise I was doing. And wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think I was necessarily forcing myself. Like, some people say that people who are bulky and have an eating disorder because you're forcing yourself to change, which that could be, I guess, a case to be made. But I don't know. My point was that it's not always about what you eat. Sometimes it's about when you eat. Sometimes it's about having that balance and making sure that you are eating for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is, right reasons. That's exactly it. It comes down to intention, right? It comes down to, and I think that's hard. I remember one of the times, and this was like later on in my food journey, that my dietitian was like, what you need to do is not what you need to do, but like, it would be good if you could think about where those crappy feelings come from and eat a little bit slower so you can think as you do it. And I had a very visceral reaction where my heart started pounding and I started sweating. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I was like, no, that sounds terrible. That's no. But what it comes down to is that intentionality piece of like, I hate to say, because once again, like, eating when you're not hungry is not a sin and it's not a bad thing, but it's almost like, why am I choosing this salad over that plate of French fries? Is it because I'm dieting, because I'm trying to lose weight, because I'm restricting? If that's not the reason, if it's like, hey, I know my body needs fiber and I know I will feel physically better if I eat this salad, then that's a very good reason to choose the salad versus shaming myself later. That's not in it.
That's a great way to kind of summarize what we were just talking about there. Yeah. So it seems like we're both ambiverted or extroverted, as you were. I was reading some of the blog posts about that you had on there. Cause most people don't know the word ambivert, let alone actually talk about it. So what are your thoughts on ambiversion or extroversion?
Sure. So what they say is the way to tell is how you recharge. I also say and for me, it's almost like what you crave or how you naturally feel comfortable. Let's say it's rare that I have the house to myself all day and that I'm not like working or something. If that's the case, my brain is like, oh my goodness, like, I have the house to myself, I'm going to read, I'm going to like play video games, I'm going to do this. Within 2 hours, I have texted 8 people to be like, hey, what are you doing? I can't sit alone. And it's very much not, I do joke about like, oh, I can't be alone with my own thoughts. I truly don't think that's the case. I like sitting alone with myself, but I like sitting alone with others more. Probably one of my favorite examples. So when I was little, like, if my mom was like sitting outside reading, I would go and be like, do you want to just literally sit inside in the same room as me while I play a video game and you can read and I can play? Because I don't want to sit by myself. I want a body. Like, I just want someone there even if we're not interacting.
Dual play.
Yeah. When I was in college, so we were in an apartment and there were 4 of us. And 2 of my roommates were not there very much. They had a lot going on. But me and my other roommate were in the apartment a lot more. And so I would come home from class and I would go and knock on her door. And she'd be like, oh yeah, open the door, you're good. So I would open it and she'd be laying on her bed doing work. And I would be like, oh, I'm going to sit in the common room and do work. And she'd be like, okay, I'll be here. And then she'd go back to typing and I would just stand in the doorway and stare at her. And she would be like, I'll come out there and do work. And I'm like, that's it, great. And then I would head back to the common room. I'd be like, fantastic. Because that's what it is. Like, I do end up feeling very down and when I'm just by myself. Also, I guess the other recharge example would be when I did finally start with my first startup. I just didn't have I was so used to having several meetings a day back when I worked in corporate and interacting with people a lot more, whether that was interacting about work or about social stuff or about nothing. I had a lot more interaction. And after a few months of working with the startup where I was having, 2 meetings a week, 3 meetings a week, I was feeling burnt out by the end. And it took me a bit to realize that it was because it was lack of human interaction. I was just not having as much as I was used to. And it bummed me out. So the way that I have picked up ambivert because first of all, I'm better in smaller groups. If I walk into a very crowded place, the social anxiety kicks in, and I didn't have social anxiety or really any quantifiable anxiety until I was in my 20s. I distinctly remember a time in college when we were in the CAF the cafeteria for, I think it was like a Christmas or Thanksgiving thing, like something where everyone was in one place at one time, and I was feeling like very anxious and having a moment of realization that it was like, I have never been like this before in my life. This is a very new thing for me. So I think between the social anxiety, either when I'm meeting new people or there's too many people, and the fact that I just prefer smaller groups, but I still prefer being with someone than being by myself. I kind of picked up, I know that if you know, you're picking a side, definitely extrovert if you're picking between introvert and extrovert, because I really do prefer being with other people, even if we're not doing anything. But also there is that not doing anything aspect that I can also appreciate, which is also, I think, on the ambivert side. Yeah.
Well, they say that basically everyone is both in some shape or form, which is interesting. But I've definitely met some people who are very much extremes on each side, which is really interesting. They're few and far in between. Like, I used to be 70-30, like 70% extrovert, 30% introvert. And I think nowadays, I don't know if it's because I spent so much time alone over the past 10 years or so, but I've become more 60-40, which is kind of weird for me. And I almost want to say that maybe, like, by my guess, you're 70-30 as well, because, like, you have that kind of, like, more extroverted side, but yeah.
Yeah, it's, I'm trying to remember when I took the MBTI. It was probably closer to 60-40 for me. I remember when she was explaining the different matrices of the Myers-Briggs. I remember her listing things as extrovert and introvert, and me, not agreeing, identifying with both of them. When she was like, oh, here's the difference between extrovert and introvert. And I'm like, oh, I could see myself falling into either of those. Yeah. But truly, I mean, but then when I think about it, I think about those moments where I'm like, you should come out in the common room and just sit near me. Or, you know, when I studied abroad in France, and literally the one friend I made every day was like, are we doing something today? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing today? Because I can't just go back to my host parents' house and sit by myself again. Like, I can't do it.
It's interesting because I often go out downtown based off of this decision, where my desire to not go out is less than my desire to not stay in.
Yep. No.
Which is weird.
No, I totally agree. So as a bit of an impulse shopper, that is actually one of the things that I use is, what will I regret more? Yes, that is definitely how I make decisions sometimes.
So what is it like for you being a multi-passionate in a world trying to pigeonhole you?
Once again, I don't feel societal pressure is that big of a, you know what I mean? I think part of it is getting over your pride. I think a huge thing is getting over your pride, because and this is a piece that I'm considering writing, whether for work or for myself, something about, the one thing about being comfortable as like a multi-passionate person or a generalist is understanding that you're never going to be the expert. You're just never going to be the expert. It's just not going to happen. Maybe you could make an argument for an expert of different intersections of things. Maybe I could see that argument being made. For me, it was, you know how people make the joke of like, oh, you like music, name every band. You know what I mean? Oh, you like Pearl Jam, name every single song that they've ever done. And, you know, it's like, no, you can enjoy things without being an expert at them. And I think it's getting over that pride of, there are people that are always going to say, well, you don't know as much as this person, or I know more than you about X, Y, or Z. And learning not to care. Learning not to give a shit that you don't know as much as someone else.
Yeah, that's a good point to make, because they always say, like, oh, the jack of all trades, master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one due to the intersection. But I created this, what's known as, like, the multidisciplinary spectrum, where you have, like, multipotentialite and generalist and polymath all on this trajectory. And it allows people to kind of point at it where, like, okay, given my knowledge areas, I'm 50% knowledge in this area, or 20% in this area. You can kind of quantify it based on other metrics. Be like, okay, I have multiple areas. I can probably put myself right here on this chart kind of thing. And it's interesting to think about, like, a specialist is probably around 70-80% knowledge area in that particular field. A hyper specialist is probably that top 20%, like, okay, 80 to 100% knowledge. But even a hyper specialist can't necessarily know everything, because our knowledge changes over the course of the decades. And so even a hyper specialist is still going to be not fully there.
There's always more to know, right? And we're always discovering new things, which is a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we're always discovering new things. Or, you know, I have said that when it comes to, like, learning a new language, you get past a certain point where, like, once you hit conversational, all those basics at this point come naturally to you, but there is a huge learning curve. The learning curve at the beginning is so small. And then you hit a point where you know nothing or you know everything. Like, but the problem is, so this is where we hit idioms. This is where we hit prepositions. This is where we hit text speak, right? Like, things like that. Text speak changes every day. Young people are inventing new ways to say things every single day. So if you learn them in your language, great. If you're calling yourself fluent in another language, you need to know those things, and they're changing every day.
I'm pretty sure, like Arabic, for example, since it's such an old language, there's a lot of words that they don't have words for.
Yeah.
And so they actually just use the English words, like cell phone, for example, is the word for cell phone in Arabic because they just don't have an equivalent because of how ancient it is, which is interesting how they, like, change that up.
I had no idea. That's interesting, and it makes sense, right? Because what are you going to do, right?
Right, and languages are always something really fun to think about, too, but exercise is kind of the same way. A lot of people get what's known as newbie gains because they progress really quickly and then they hit that plateau. And I think every skill kind of has that same similar structure. Perhaps the plateau is a little bit bigger for some skills or smaller for others. Languages and exercise, I think, are kind of pretty medium intensity-wise. But it's interesting how people get really cocky about getting all those gains right at the beginning, and then the first wall hits them and they give up. Or they have to work really hard to get past that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, as someone who is definitely more, like, very, very on the generalist spectrum, I am so far generalist that it's probably pathetic. But I'm so...
No. Not at all. You're on the perfect place.
Once I do hit that wall, I wouldn't say give up, but I'm like, I'd rather go learn something. I'd rather hit that point on something else than keep going because I recognize how steep this curve is. I'm like, okay, I could trudge up this path, or I go try something else and learn something new, or I could learn 3 more things in the time that it would take me to go up this path. And I'm like, for the most part, I'm like, I'd rather just not.
So this leads into my next question pretty well too, but I want to touch on this. I both agree with you completely, but also the other side of me is also just thinking, like, you lack discipline.
You see? You see?
Yeah. But it's funny because I talk about this a lot with education. So a lot of my content's around self-education and new ways of approaching learning. And I talk about skill tree-based learning. So, like, you're a video game player. You probably experienced skill trees. I don't know, like PlayStation's Spider-Man, for example, has skill trees. Web slinging, fighting, and then, like, chemistry, right? And you're going down different pathways. But let's say you can't progress down this one pathway anymore and you want to switch to something else. And you're going down, you have that choice to do so. That's where I think learning needs to be, because there's going to be people like you and I who, yes, we could fight that plateau, but should we? Right. That's what we have to ask ourselves. Is it prudent at this time to keep progressing down that one tree, or should we go down a different branch and focus on something else?
Well, and I would argue, so I think this is that whole finding that balance between saving, preparing for the future, and recognizing that tomorrow isn't promised. So it's not only is it prudent for me, it's like, if I die tomorrow, will I be like, damn, I wish, I feel like if I went past that plateau and I were to die tomorrow, I'd be like, damn, I wish I had just learned 80 new things instead. You know what I mean? That's what I prefer to be doing with my time. It's how would you prefer to spend your time?
Yeah. Well, and I also think about, like, progression. Like, my goal for any of my clients, for example, is to constantly make someone progress farther forward. Not make them, obviously, but, like, get them to progress forward. Like, I had a swim lesson once where I taught this kid for 45 minutes straight, and she was just completely not having it. Her focus wasn't there. It was not a good day, right? Normally, she's a great swim lesson, and, like, we had many great days. 45 minutes goes by, I don't think she's made even 1% progress. She wasn't paying much attention, or at least I didn't think she was, and she wasn't really trying to do the exercises I was trying to get her to do. And the parent was asking me, do you want to continue or do you want to stop? And in my gut, like, my head, I probably wanted to stop.
Right.
But in my gut, I was like, you should keep going, 15 more minutes, make it an hour. It's not that big of a deal. If she doesn't work, then it's fine. You got 15 more minutes. But if she does work, that could make a big progress. And at the end, something clicked, and she got 1 or 2% better at the skill that we were working that, and that's all it took for me to feel accomplished as a teacher. And I think for her, she got pretty excited too about it. So that's the thing. That last little push is what got it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of like what you said. Her as a student, like, it's so easy to get discouraged, right? If you don't make any progress. Where I say this about escape rooms a lot. I love escape rooms. Escape rooms are one of my favorite things. I say that a lot about escape rooms, where a lot of pretty much whether or not you're going to make it out of the room, room complexity aside, that first 20 minutes is crucial, because it's morale at that point. You know what I mean? If you can't figure something out in 20 minutes, your morale is so low that it doesn't matter. You're going to miss easy things. You're going to feel stupid. It's not going to matter. Whereas you figure out something in the first 20 minutes, you feel like you're brilliant, and all of a sudden you could do the hardest room possible.
On a side note, before I switched to this shirt to match my branding more so, I was wearing my escape room shirt that I had gotten from the job, because one of the jobs was working at an escape room place in town for like a year, and I ran multiple different kinds of rooms, that kind of thing. So I totally understand what you're saying there. It's interesting because people will give up at the beginning and then they weren't able to get out. People who even just solve that one little puzzle, even if it's something simple, it's like motivation snowballing.
Exactly. No, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, for sure. Oh, I could talk escape room theory all day. Yeah, you want to talk about weird escape room stuff? I'm down. I'm here.
I'll put that on the side burner for now, or maybe we can do it, like we can have a whole video one day just talking about escape rooms, because that'd be kind of fun too.
I'm so down.
When it comes to being multidisciplinary, I kind of see it as two pathways, and we kind of touched on that a little moment ago, where it's like you could either juggle everything all at once, or you can kind of serial focus on one thing, then switch to the next thing, then switch to the next thing. What are your thoughts on that?
That's such an interesting thing, and I think that's definitely, I could see that being the difference between people that I've talked to that are generalists, how they operate. Like, oh, let me master this and then move on. Let me master this and then move on. And I'm a perpetual novice. I would rather keep learning different things, try different things. I definitely prioritize variety over almost everything else. When I did leave my corporate job, and then actually when I lost my job at the first startup, when I was interviewing, first of all, I was like, I'm done lying in interviews. You know what I mean? How they tell you to say certain things in interviews, and no, I'm done, not doing it anymore. I literally would sit down and they would be like, oh, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And my response was, if every day is not the same here and I'm learning and growing, I'll be here as long as you want me. Like, I don't care. Yeah. I just don't want to, I can't, and it's not even stagnate, like, oh, I don't know. I don't even like to use the word stagnation here. It's just, I need to do different things. I get so bored doing the same thing. Yeah. So for me, it's bouncing. It's bouncing, short bursts of energy, all different kinds of things.
And it's interesting too, because I do think we end up doing both in our lives. Probably, like, I think maybe right, maybe your 20 to 30 years are your juggling years, and then from 30 to 40 you'll start serializing, and then 40 to 50 you'll start juggling again. I think that we'll go back and forth. A lot of times I've looked at people's like lives in the past, and they've been more serialized. That's where it was more common to do that. Like, for 10 years you're doing one job, for 10 years you're doing another job. But by the end of their lives, they became more polymathic because they had 4 or 5 of those different jobs.
Right.
But for you and I, because I'm a little bit in the middle where I like to serialize, but I also really do like to juggle. I kind of like to have more of a T-shaped, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. Like a more medium focus. Maybe not serial, like a high focus like some people do, but more medium and then sides.
Right.
But yeah, I think juggling is possible, but a lot of people don't believe it is. And what you and I know that it is, it's just we have to work hard at making sure that each one gets touched. Each plate keeps spinning and they don't fall down.
I also think, so here's the thing, once again, my brain goes, naturally do what you want to do and see how that falls. And for me, I'm like, oh, that falls into juggling. But I think someone looking at my life from the outside would be like, no, it doesn't. Like, you know what I mean? You do the blog every single week. You write a lot. Like, it's not, this is not something that's small, like, oh, I'm just going to drop it next week. Like, you literally have had a blog for 4 years and you're writing a book. Yeah. Like, no, Renata, you write. Like, it's one of the things you do. Yeah, so
self-perception.
Yeah,
then.
So I think exactly. Yeah. So I think for me, I'd be like, no, like I can't do the same thing ever, and someone would look at me and be like, just some of the things you do are the same thing over and over. Like,
well, okay, so I think part of that we're both talking about juggling as if it's like, okay, it's it's a fire that we have to keep going. But sometimes it's a matter of just, some things are juggling on its own, you know?
That's true.
Like some things have been so perfect. You spun it so many times that it's still going on its own, even without you having to hold the stick.
I love the metaphor. I love that you found a new way to use this metaphor. Amazing.
Yeah. And it's funny because, like, I did my Now page update this past weekend, which is my monthly vlog that I do. And I done it for 27 months in a row.
Nice.
And it's kind of crazy to think about. Like, I feel like it was just yesterday that I started it, and it's been like over 2 years, I guess, at this point. Yeah. So something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
So for me, it's just enjoying variety. It really is. Like, for me, it's just being more excited about trying something new than becoming an expert at something. For me, that's what it is. And so it's wanting to learn all different things. Every time I talk to people about their career paths, when I was younger and still, I say still figuring my stuff out. Every day we're figuring things out. But like when I was younger and talking to people about career paths, the ones that I was most jealous of would be like, oh, I worked in a bakery for 2 years. Oh, and then I washed dogs. And then I did this. And then I did that. I'm like, that's exactly what I want. I want these different experiences and it's not only learning different skills. Like when I say learning about myself, learning by meeting new people, like learning about new cultures, new ways of thinking. Like, think about it. The people you meet working in a bakery are not going to be the people you meet dog grooming, right? Like, those are two different sets of people with two different mindsets, two different sets of priorities, just different people in general. And I loved that. I loved that they, one of my friends was like, yeah, like my mom wants me to go to school, do this, do that, so that my career plan is like a very clear linear trajectory, because she did all these different things. And I'm like, see, I would rather be your mom. I would rather do 80 different things and then look back at my life and be like, do you remember that weird time I was doing that weird thing? Amazing. Like, that's just, variety for me over expertise any day of the week.
I love that. And we were talking about escape rooms a moment ago. It's like, I worked for an escape room for a year.
Right.
And that's part of me now. And it's one of those things where, like, now we can bond over that. And also, too, it taught me how to think differently, too.
Yeah.
Going into those rooms and seeing how different puzzles are laid out, or how different rooms are laid out. You can almost predict how certain things are going to go. Like, I know that there was a certain space. Once one room got cut and we were putting a new one in, I knew that there was a secret room back there. So I knew at some point there had to be a secret room. It's like knowing patterns like that, for example, too.
And once again, then for people like us, we take those and apply those to different things. And then it's just really cool to see how things connect together.
I remember at one point there was a friend of mine, her friend who I kind of knew. I would see her everywhere. So I worked at Gerb's. I saw her at Gerb's. I worked at, which is basically Kroger, right?
Okay.
I worked at another grocery store. Saw her there. I saw her at my gym that I have worked at for the past 10 years. My main job, I guess you could say. I worked at an escape room place. Saw both of them there.
Right.
And then on top of that, I saw them at the football game where I was an elevator operator pressing a button and saying hi to people for 9 hours. It's like, she was almost saying, like, why are you everywhere? And I'm just like, I need a job. So like, there we go.
It's just something interesting to do. Like, oh, okay, you need someone to do this random crap? Sure. Yeah, I'll do the random crap. Great.
Well, it's interesting, too, because that elevator operator was in the suites of the football stadium. So all of the more higher-end people who are coming to the stadium, I got to interact with for however long the elevator ride was. So that was interesting.
That is very cool. Yeah.
Speaking of polymathy, a close cousin is being a generalist, and so you brought that to my attention of the website of All Trades. Thanks to you, I was also able to connect with Britt F. Gage, the founder. Can you explain the site a bit?
Sure. Well, we are a company that essentially Britt pulls in generalists for a generalist collective, a curated collective. So it's a bunch of us that, I see the other generalists sometimes in meetings, like we'll talk on Slack, but primarily I'm working with startup partners that Britt has also connected with. And then I go in and help them in any way that they need. So they know my skill set. I talk to them about my skill set and we can match things up. But there have been several times where if I'm very close to a founder, they'll be like, hey, I need help with this random thing. Either I don't know how to do it or I'm going to train you on how to do it because I don't want to keep doing this. It's not in your skill set. Can you learn it? Sure. Throw it at me, bring it on. I'll try that. So it's a nice way to be able to build and foster relationships with startup partners, which I'm very grateful for. I don't like doing one-off jobs because I like fostering relationships. So it's fostering the relationships with them to the point where, number one, I'm doing different things for them every week anyway, but then they can throw me different things and I can learn new tools, learn new things. It's perfect. It's perfect for me.
I think I signed up, but like hadn't necessarily gotten to the next step yet. But probably I need to push for that because I've been looking for jobs. I have some time to kill for it. What are your thoughts on being a startup generalist? I know you kind of touched on that just a moment ago, but maybe more generalized.
So it's exactly what I was looking for without knowing that it existed. When I was leaving corporate, and I was, once again, writing was the main thing I wanted to be doing. Social media and content creation were the main things that I had the ability to do, and I knew that they were creative, and I wanted to be creative. It's a shame because that's the other thing, I'm analytically and creative minded, so finding something where it's both of those is a bit of a challenge. So I read, I'm not going to say I read the whole thing because that would be a lie. I read pieces of What Color is Your Parachute? And what that boiled down and really helped me see was essentially, there are different facets of jobs that you should prioritize, right? Like, these are my non-negotiables, these are my negotiables. And at the end of the day, what I realized was that culture was more important to me than anything else, and startups would have that culture, but also startups would need kind of someone that was all hands on deck. And since I knew I would get bored so easily of doing the same thing, I was like, oh, maybe startups will be kind of where I gravitate towards that need more help. And so the first startup I worked for, I did 7 or 8 different things. And they would just throw me random tasks and I got to learn them. So it shifted my what I was prioritizing in my job search from a certain position, which wasn't working for me because all of them sounded terrible, to a certain culture and a certain, I guess culture is the right way, a certain company size, right? Like just smaller startups that really needed help.
Well, I think the bigger corporate places, they also have a really hard time describing their job descriptions too. Recruiters are making these, I don't want to go on a tangent, but they're making these freaking digital marketing specialist job listings, for example, and they'll list out, SEO, pay-per-click, ads, social media, content creation. Those are multiple different skills. You don't want a digital marketing specialist. You want a digital marketing generalist. Okay.
Yeah.
Make that as your title so people can actually know what they're looking for.
I had a friend who he's not in recruiting anymore, but back when he was a recruiter and I was looking for something else, I was like, hey, I need some help. And he said, here's the problem. He said, I don't know when everything's going to go sideways as far as the job market. He said, the problem is I'll go to a company and they'll say, hey, I need someone with A, B, C, and D. And he'll be like, okay, those 4 skills don't exist in one person. What I can give you is A, B, and D with like some experience in C. No, we need C fully. And he goes, here's the problem. You want a purple unicorn. I can get you a purple horse. No problem. Unicorns don't exist.
But you don't have the horn.
Right. Yeah. So he was like, that's the problem, is that they're looking for something very specific and they're not going to find it. It's just not going to happen. There's no one that has, like, it's like those job descriptions where they're like, oh, you need at least 5 years experience in this program. And people are looking at it like, that program was created 2 years ago. What do you mean you need 5 years of experience? It's impossible. Or
they need 5 years for an entry-level role or something like that. And I will say, too, like, maybe that purple unicorn does exist, but they're not going to apply to your job because of the way you're describing it and the way that you're trying to ask for it and the way that you're putting through so many hoops to get to this job.
Yeah.
There's a company in town that makes you go through, like, 10 interviews almost, or maybe not, I'm exaggerating, maybe it's like 5 interviews, but even that's still excessive just to get told no.
Exactly.
Most of the time. It's like weird.
Yeah, or ones where they make you do work for free, where they're like, oh, do all these projects for us and then maybe we'll hire you. I'm like, I would rather work for places that pay me money to do for goods and services. Like,
oh, so weird. Well, something I saw on your site too, like, what is a generalist anchor?
Something that I made up completely.
Yes, which is why I'm asking you.
So this is because I was talking to my boss. I have a theory that I've talked to you a little bit about that, and I don't know. I mean, this is a chicken before the egg thing. I don't know which one is more predisposed to the other. I believe that generalists are probably more predisposed to being polyamorous, or the other way around. People that are polyamorous are more predisposed to being generalists because it does have that general feel. So I was talking to my boss about this theory, and she is monogamous, and that's fine. Right, totally fine. But she was like, I think in my relationships, that is the one thing that I want to be stable. I want, everything else can be changing. I want the variety. I want everything to be different every day. I need something to be stable. And my brain immediately went, I don't understand that at all. Because I am polyamorous at heart. Even if I'm not practicing, I am, I consider myself to be a polyamorous individual. I'm like, I don't understand. Like, no, I want variety in my relationships, just like I want variety in my jobs, just like whatever. And then I sat back and thought about it, and I thought about the media I consume, and I have always attributed this to depression. I don't know if it would be depression, anxiety, or just generally how I am as a person. I rewatch shows. I don't consume new media if I can avoid it. I reread books. I replay video games. There are some new things that I will pick up, but I need to be very not depressed in order to do that, and that is not always the case for me. So I was like, oh, to be fair, like I had kind of approached the way she had said that to me with like, oh no, I'm not like that. I don't need anything to be the same all the time. And then
you kind of
literally, and then my fiance yelled at me for watching Nailed It for the 80th time that week. So I was like, oh, maybe I do need that. And so that's what I called my generalist anchor, like the one thing that I don't want to change, that I want to stay the same.
What I think is interesting is that it's not a causation, but there is that correlation. I think that you're kind of right where it's not chicken or egg. Polyamorous people could also be predisposed to like being generalists, but generalists could also be more polyamorous by nature too. I think just because both of them are being that variety kind of centered mind, and because of that, they could lead them into being generalist, or the opposite, generalists can maybe be more polyamorous. I think there's not necessarily one as the starter,
right,
but maybe it's more common for generalists to go that way. I don't know.
Right.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Right. I've always thought, so not only I've always prioritize variety, but I've also always thought kind of equal, like everyone's equal, you know what I mean? Like I never put like one partner above anyone else. I never put, my partner super far above my friends. Like it was just everything was equal. And so I think that's a big thing too, where once again, job wise, like I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this one thing and then do like these other things a little, like I just need to do all different things.
Mm-hmm. Something I get asked about a lot in confusion with Polymath, and it's probably a good person for me to talk to about this, honestly. First person I could talk to about it is the lifestyle of being polyamorous, but also the polymathy. Can you give me a distinction between the two?
So, well, actually, when you're poly, people usually associate it with polygamy, which is marrying multiple wives, and that's not what polyamory is. Polyamory is being open to having committed relationships with multiple people. Polymathy is more or less just that sort of generalist, multi-potentialite mindset, right? Of like just wanting to do many different things, having many different interests that are in different fields and not necessarily the same thing. Poly, right? Poly's in both because it's multiple, because it's having interests.
Much or many.
Yep. Having interests across the board. So to me, I'm like, no, they both make sense to me, right? They both describe who I am as a person really well. Multiple, many, not choosing one. Don't make me choose one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because I have PolyInnovator, like my name on my business card, and I'll hand it to somebody at the karaoke bar, for example, and they're like, "You're poly?" And I'm like, "Not the kind of poly you think I am." Like, not that I don't have anything against polyamorous people or something like that, but like, or even polygamy people, but it's just one of those things where it's like, no, different kind of poly.
Yeah.
Something we talk about a lot is how do we describe ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. We have our resumes, we have our LinkedIns, we have our social media presence, our personal brands, that kind of thing. And I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn, and I would always like look at some of the best profiles on there and try to copy it. And then I get to like your profile, and I get self-conscious because I look at all your experiences on there, and you have one of the most like longest lists of job experiences I've seen on LinkedIn, and that's saying something considering my work.
So I would say, hustle culture sucks, first of all. However, the one thing that I have liked it for in the past, so first of all, I've liked it to get experience in things that, so like writing, blogging, social media, translation, these are all things that when I was working in corporate, I wasn't getting in my daily life, that I really wanted to gain experience in, and I knew that I wouldn't have the discipline to like take a course in it or do it if it was of my own accord. So I was like, okay, if I have a client that needs it by a certain deadline, it will get done. And it always did. You know what I mean? I always knew that I had to get it done, whether or not I felt like doing it that day, whatever. So while I'm not a huge fan of being like work every day of your life, work 10 hours a day, etc., I have very much enjoyed freelance opportunities because they gave me the variety. I really needed the variety. So like we said, extroverts get energized from interacting with a lot of people, whereas that would make introverts feel very, get rid of their energy. But, for me, variety is what boosts my energy. So yes, I'm working more hours, but I'm getting a little bit more energy from just trying something new. So that's what you're seeing a lot of. You're seeing a lot of me trying out different freelance things, being like, oh, this is technically a skill I have now. Like, yes, I only learned it for one job, but now I have it. So if you need me to use it, I can.
It's interesting too, because like sometimes when people go on LinkedIn too, they'll look at that long list and they'll get overwhelmed and they don't want to read through it. And I definitely noticed too that you've put a lot of detail into each one of your posts as well, which is like takes a lot of effort. So congrats on that, by the way. I think considering of all worlds, the site we were talking about earlier, your long list probably actually helps out a lot for that if they look at your LinkedIn. I wonder if you went on like a LinkedIn job hunt and you applied to something there and they look at your page, what people might think as a recruiter or something like that.
Oh, I mean, I've applied it. So it's interesting because I do feel like, so there was a time fairly recently, end of last year, beginning of this year, that I was job hunting. No, I mean, even startups, I felt like I wasn't even really getting looked at. There were a couple that I would talk to, but in all honesty, they needed someone that was more specialized than I was. So I'm an optimist. I would say I'm mostly a realist, but I'm a decent amount optimistic, where I would apply to something and be like, I think what I have fits this perfectly, and then literally never hear back again. Like it even things where it looked like they were looking for a generalist, or they put jack of all trades in there, they really either weren't, or they didn't end up hiring for it. They ended up hiring internally, whatever. I can only guesstimate what they were doing. But no, I appreciate that you find my LinkedIn impressive, but no, several hiring managers have not.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of what I was thinking about too, because I literally applied to, I'm going to name drop ConvertKit recently.
Okay.
And a famous email tool, and I think they were looking for someone who was more generalist or something like that. It was like a education content series creator kind of thing. And I put a lot of effort into the application. I remember that they had a lot of variety in their job listing, like what they were wanting. Mm-hmm. And then I just get an email back, oh yeah, sorry, no, good luck on your search, bye. Yeah. And it's like, they don't even give you the opportunity to understand why they said no. And like, yes, there's not a rule that they have to do it, but it's good recruiters will, and it's just frustrating.
I have a theory. So I have your neuroscience major friend has a bunch of experiments that I either want to run on people or other things that are once again pointless and mean nothing, or mean something, I don't know. So you know how there are a lot of tools that recruiters are using where the resumes scan before it even gets to a person they're looking for keywords? So what about keyword stuffing resumes? I wonder who has tried that, right? Like, it'll at least get past that initial thing, and then if they see it and they're interested, I mean, don't get me wrong. If they're interested and then realize that the algorithm for the resume isn't working, they might be like, what did you do? And it's like, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, it's in white on the very bottom, so you can't read it.
Yeah. At like 5%
exactly.
Size, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my brain goes, if what is tripping people up is that, right, is the fact that there's not one single keyword that needs to be on there. I mean, keyword stuff or resume.
I would argue that maybe 67% of resumes are getting thrown out purely because of those algorithms. Yep. And it's one of those things too where I don't have an official degree. I have my master's degree that I created. I have a year experience at college too, and I have a variety of other education experiences. But for the most part, I don't have a piece of paper saying I have a degree. And so there's a lot of times when my resume gets thrown out purely because of that.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. On a different note, you taught Zumba for a time and talk about yoga as well at this point. I taught water aerobics. Both are fun, engaging classes. What is your experience being a fitness teacher?
Getting my
out now.
Getting my Zumba instructor certification was possibly, arguably, the best thing I've ever done for my self-esteem. It was really, really solidly, like, I've never experienced anything like that, I don't think. I think I've carried a lot of that through with me, even though I'm not teaching anymore. Like, I still, when I say that sometimes I dance with Zumba instructor face, right? Because, I mean, as you know, if you need to give literally like 120% enthusiasm to get the people at 40%. Yes. Like, they are not going to be enthusiastic unless you're, so like when I dance now, I like make faces, I like smile and like, engage with the people I'm dancing with. And they're probably like, why is she looking at me like that? And I'm like, I can't.
It's creepy.
You can't stop the Zumba instructor face. I can't stop it. but it was really, really great for my self-esteem. It was a lot of fun. And it was also, I mean, so it was that discipline accountability piece, right? I was like, I can't miss these Zumba classes because I'm teaching them. I need to show up, you know, there, or it doesn't happen
That's how my
without
water
me.
aerobics was too. I had to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forces you to do it. So it was great for that. I mean, it was one of my many jobs that I had on campus. Once again, as a generalist, I did so many different jobs on campus. It was wow.
I've never thought about campus being a good, I don't know, pool of jobs kind of thing.
I mean, I worked in orientation all 4 years. I was Zoom instructor for 3 years. I worked in the bookstore and the convenience store. I worked in the mailroom. Actually, when I went abroad, one of the women I met was like, "Oh, you're the Absolutely girl," and I'm like, "The Absolutely girl?" And she goes, "Yeah, we call you the Absolutely girl because we would go to package pickup to pick up, you know, something that was sent to us, and we'd be like, 'Oh, can you go get this?' And you'd be like, 'Absolutely,' and then you would go back, and I'm like, that's how chipper I was to be at work. Like, what is wrong with me?"
I'm gonna write that down.
So yeah, you know, and it was the variety. It was different people. It was really nice. Like, I could do a little bit of work and then someone would come up to, like, if, let's say I'm back at the apartment and I have 3 hours, it's like, okay, Renata, you should do homework for 3 hours, and I'll feel crappy about myself in 3 hours if I haven't done as much as I expected. I could bring my textbook into the convenience store, read 3 pages, and then someone comes up and it's like, okay, no, I have to ring them up. This is my job. That's what I'm here for. They're letting me read on my free time because that's very nice of them, but I have to be doing this other thing. And so it felt good to be like, I'm technically doing something productive, but I don't have to be doing my schoolwork, and I can do it in little bursts instead of, 3-hour chunks.
It's interesting too because, like you said, the whole 120% enthusiasm.
Yeah.
I would teach, like, I got my first job, full-time job, this past summer, and it was weird for me to work 8 hours straight.
Yeah.
But what was more hard was it was a medium intensity physical labor kind of job. It was at a warehouse, and one thing you mentioned earlier about the social kind of contact, I ran out of energy because I literally had hardly any contact with other people for multiple stretches at a time. And it was one of those things where I was also not used to working 8 hours straight like that. I was used to working 1 or 2 hours at a sprint, where I taught 2 classes or a class and a couple clients before and after. And I would work extra hard for those 3 hours, like you said, 120%.
Right.
But that's what I was used to.
So back at my corporate job, the last position I had was very reactive. It wasn't very proactive. So because I handled the transportation management system. I managed our TMS. And so if something broke on it, I needed to be free literally my entire 8 hours to focus on that and nothing else. If nothing broke, though, I was hardly doing anything. So there were 2 or 3 days a week where I was hardcore pushing because I had something to do. But then the other days I kind of sat back and waited for something to break. And so when I started at my startup job after that, I was talking to my life coach and I was like, working 8 hours a day, it's just a lot for me. And she's like, weren't you doing that before? And I'm like, no. I'm like, no, I wasn't doing that before. 8 hours is a lot. It's a lot to work. Yeah.
Well, and especially when there wasn't enough stimuli either. Like, once I learned the systems of the job, the analytical mind, like you were saying, like once I fully understood the systems, I was bored.
Right.
And so something that we talked about a little bit earlier was languages, and I should have probably asked this question earlier too. It's like, you speak a few languages and are a budding polyglot, another poly, if you will. What is your understanding of French and Spanish?
So at this point, I would put it, I almost hate to even say conversational French. I feel like I'm not really there anymore. Basic probably for both, and less so even for Spanish. I also, when I was abroad in France, the requirements for the neuroscience major changed. So I called my advisor, and so because of where I was at, I could have been grandfathered in, or I could take the new requirements. I could go either way. So it really wasn't a bad thing for me. But I said, hey, I would like to, at my college at Dickinson, I don't know if it's this way anymore, but if you had a certain number of classes in any Romance language, you could jump straight into advanced Portuguese. And so I really wanted to do that. I thought that would be cool. Like, I didn't want to take another 101, but but it was like Portuguese, like 116 or something like that. Does sound really cool. So, and the only time it was offered was in the fall, so I wouldn't be able to take it in the spring. So I'm on the phone with my advisor. I'm like, okay, this is going to sound really strange. I'm like, I really want to take Portuguese next semester. Is there any way I can fit it in and get all my requirements done? And he looked at the new requirements and the old ones, and he's like, if we go by the new requirements, actually there's a way for you to finagle it. Yeah, do it. And I'm like, great, sweet. So I did that too. And Spanish, actually, so the main reason why I continued that was because once you got past the 116 level at my college, you could go abroad. And I wanted to study in Spain as well. So I did that for the summer program and then went abroad to France the following spring. So yeah, and I learned in Spain, I learned that I love translation. I fell in love with it. Absolutely. I absolutely love translation, localization, whatever. Yeah.
We need to take a note down for that because a lot of great creators translate content into other languages.
Yeah.
And so, like Mr. Beast, for example, has a Spanish channel and a French channel, a Portuguese channel, or maybe not French, but at least Portuguese and Spanish. And it's like at some point, I know there's some tools that do it, but they're really bad, and I need to have someone to check, like what it says. So maybe we can talk about that too.
I mean, I would 100% argue that translation is like a generalist multi-potentialite thing because you can't be, you can't only know another language. I've talked to people who only know another language they can't translate because it doesn't have anything to do with what the words mean. It has to do with what's behind the words. You have to be a good writer and know another language. And it's you need to marry those two in just the right way to take the text and create it in a way that's colloquial instead of just translating verbatim.
You need to have that immersion too. Like I've done immersion, school, and Duolingo as like learning modalities for language. And ironically, I would say Duolingo is a pretty close to immersion level of learning. But school never really did it much for me. Like I took many Spanish classes in school and I barely learned anything. I spent a lot of time in Duolingo and I've actually learned a lot of vocabulary that I didn't know before. But I also grew up with Spanish speakers. My biological father and my stepdad are Mexican, at least to some degree. And so I grew up around Spanish speakers. I should say I'm fluent in Spanish, but I'm probably more conversational, like you were saying earlier too. It's like one of those things where maybe I am higher than I think I am, but it's one of those things where like nervousness.
Yeah.
And then like French, I know basic like just some words kind of thing, but it's because of Duolingo. I dabbled. I tried Esperanto even, which is not a Romance language, but it's kind of similar, and it's really fun language. La canabo esta bona, like it rolls off the tongue, just like the cool Latin languages, but it has the oomph to German. What was my point, though? Hold on. Yeah, at one point, there was this polymathy researcher, Michael Araki, and he had one of his papers, but it was in Portuguese, because that's his native language. And it was really interesting how, because I know a little bit of Italian, a little bit of French, and a decent amount of Spanish, I was able to somewhat translate that page just by reading it and like understand what it was saying, just because I know the meaning behind the words in different languages. I know the meaning in the French version of that word, despite the fact that I might not speak French very well.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, the Romance languages they're similar enough. I also, what I found, so I mean, I took Italian so sparingly, but it's just the minute words that I know. It's interesting because I feel like we as Americans with the Germanic language, we typically say Spanish and Italian are so similar, and I'm like, that's not really true. Like, they're similar in the fact that you pronounce every single letter, sure, fine, like, but when it comes to individual words, I found that Italian is much closer to French. I would need to look into it more, to be fair. I don't know enough Italian to definitively say that, but like, I mean, domani, right? Like tomorrow. I mean, in Spanish it's mañana. It's not even close, but in French it's demain. It's like the same, it's almost the same word.
I think Italian's really interesting because like a lot of the words that are saying like pollo for chicken is the same.
Right.
And maybe pronunciation's slightly different, but like como kind of thing. There's a lot of words that you'll say the exact same time or way in Italian and Spanish, but then there's a lot of words that are spelled or the words are actually French based, which is interesting too.
Yeah.
So like even though there's a lot of similarities between those two, there's also the other way around too. People don't realize that because they don't speak French.
Right, or because French seems different because you don't pronounce all the letters, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And the smoothness is different too. Like Spanish has a flow, a rhythm, but it's not as smooth as French.
And it's a different, so this I find, once again, without actual knowledge, these are all speculations, please, please don't take any of these for fact. This is not like Renata, the neuroscience professor, no. I think part of the issue is that Spanish probably uses similar muscles that we use to speak English, whereas French, you don't use those. You know, you drop an octave, like when I speak French, quand je parle français, like I am speaking a much lower octave like than when I speak English. But first of all, I forced myself to do that. I forced myself to use different muscles. And also, you know, I recognize that different muscles need to be used, whereas people, sometimes if they try to speak a different language, they just use the same muscles, and it's not going to come out with the accent you want.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, too, I find the funness of learning language is learning the accent and learning the tonalities. I like doing that more than I like actually learning the words, which is kind of funny because I can understand certain emotions in like Russian, despite the fact I know hardly any words in Russian.
Right. Yeah, I think part of it for me is, though, once again, getting past that plateau, because now I'm like, oh my God, now I need to know all the dialects, you know, now I need to know Spanish dialect, and also, you know, Latin American dialect and Mexican dialect, and they're all different.
Couple more questions before we end up wrapping up here, but how do you handle your divergent skill set as a personal brand, considering all of your online content? How do you explain to others your multidisciplinary life?
I mean, part of me says not being branded is a brand, you know what I mean? Which is probably not helpful at all, right? Because it's the exact opposite, you know. When I've talked in the past, like with my like life coach, and she's been like, oh, well, finding a brand is going to help with whatever. And I've kind of explained how not having a brand works better for me. She's like, okay, then you need to become the brand. You need to just put it all under renataleo.com and not mess with it. And I mean, fair. I just don't, like you said, I just don't like to be pigeonholed. Like even the blog, you know, when people talk to me about it, and you know, if you look it up, like everyone's immediate instinct is like, oh, it's a cooking blog because you talk about buffalo sauce, and it's more or less like I couldn't come up with one topic that I was like, oh, I can talk about this every week. Like, no, I can talk about my life and just decide on something that is very, very distinct to my life. Buffalo sauce just happens to be very distinct to my life. So I just, once again, I don't think the branding is as important as just doing what I like to do. It would be very different if I did this with the intention of something coming out of it, right? The blog becoming, you know, this next big thing, or selling a huge product. Like, even the book, as much as I want it out there and as much as I'm going to promote it and go to bookstores and sell it, it's not, the point of it isn't to make my entire income. So it's not like I have to push past whatever in me. And also, I guess part of it is just following your truth and doing what you believe in, right? Like, when it comes to the book, if we're going to put a brand on it, a lot of it is that you do you, get rid of shoulds, you know, kind of push against a lot of what typical self-help books say. And that's easy for me to promote because mental health is very important to me. It just comes very naturally to me to be like, yes, I'm just going to be a mental health advocate and talk about how important it is to do what you like to do and what you want to do. Screw everybody else. It's just very natural.
I like how you understand yourself pretty well, and I like that because I think the way that you explained it was interesting. Is that your personal brand, you don't necessarily have to define it as much as maybe I would, for example, because I do want something out of this. I do want something out of my personal brand. I want to make my income off of it at some point in the future. I'm okay with it taking a while. Like, I think I have that patience and self-empathy on that regard, but I am also kind of impatient on that too. I want to go faster. But considering that the niche, or as I like to say, the meta niche, the non-niche, if you will, is polymathy, that's kind of what my main topic is. But then it spreads out to different factors beyond that, swimming or exercise or education. Right. And the consistency, like, I can do a swimming post every week, in which I do. I've been making a swimming post for the past 15 weeks consistently. It does help to batch some of those out. So when you are feeling it, like you said earlier, like, I only do it when I'm feeling it. You could batch and use as much of that feeling as you can.
Yes.
Yeah. And they're also very simple posts to make a whole bunch at once. But it's one of the things where, like, my consistency is based off of how I feel, like you. But I also have to push myself a little bit more and define myself more because of where I'm at.
Right. And I think part of it is different too. Whereas when your brand is, you know, mental health, right? When your brand is you, screw everybody else, do what you want to do. Well, then in that case, it is very on brand for me to say screw discipline, right? Like that, you know what I mean? It would be very against my brand if I was like, no, I have to do this. I actually, I wrote a post about not being an overachiever. I literally wrote a post called Don't Be an Overachiever. And I wrote it while waiting in line for crumble cookies. And I was like, Renata, you are such a hypocrite. It's like, are you serious? Like, don't don't go above and beyond for no freaking reason. And I'm literally like typing, and they're like, what kind of cookie do you want? I'm like, red velvet. I'm like just typing, like mindlessly, right? So there is definitely some level of figuring my own stuff out as I and practicing what I preach.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's one of those things where like you're definitely following your own rhythm there. You're following what you preach, and one thing, it's confusing because I don't think it's discipline per se. I think it's more of just organization. And so how you organize your personal brand isn't necessarily discipline based. It's more of just creativity based. Like I had to create this own information substructure for my site and find a way to organize all the different topics on there. And like WordPress was where it made it actually really hard for me to do that, which is why I switched to Ghost in the past. But it's interesting how like it's not necessarily discipline in that regard, but it is to other people it might seem that way.
I guess for me, I would call it discipline because I've put out a blog post every Wednesday for the past 4 years. And so it's like, well, I don't want one to not go out. So I'm just going to buckle down and do it and actually it was cute. I went with my cousins to to Crumble, and my 16-year-old cousin was like, oh, I'm going to drive, and I have 2 licensed drivers in the car. And so he was excited. And so, I stood with them and I wrote 1,000 words. And on the way back, I'm like, guys, do you mind if I read this out loud to you? And they're like, oh, no, that's fine. And I get done, and they're like, you just wrote that while you were waiting in line? And I'm like, yeah. I just did.
I think it's also just the creative in you as well.
Yeah, that's exactly. Like, it wasn't, it was a little bit of a struggle to, like, kind of get started and get going. And that's the other thing, like, you keep reading about how, motivation doesn't get you started. It's what happens after you get started. And I'm like, oh man, I just gotta get, sometimes I'm like, I just gotta get past the hump. Yeah.
Speaking of personal brands, where can people find you online?
Okay. So the blog is buffalosauceeverywhere.com. So use that to read some really weird stuff. Sometimes it's about being a generalist. Sometimes it's about not overachieving. Sometimes it's about yoga. This week it was about boots. So, I guess at this point, last week I should say, was about boots and boot season. So it's whatever. It's kind of a fun place to come and hang out. Come and argue with me in the comments. I don't argue. It wouldn't actually be an argument. I post on Twitter and Instagram sparingly. My handles on there are at Renata Leo. My Twitter is more fun. I've been doing regular SpongeBob quotes on Twitter, so that might be more fun to hang out there. I don't know.
I definitely have links for you in the description there. Cool. What could be like a call to action for the audience today?
So the book hasn't come out yet. So part of me is like, go buy the book is not really.
When is it coming out?
I don't know yet. I'm still working on that. Yeah. You know what? A call to action, celebrate yourself. I think that would be a very Renata call to action, right? Like, think of one awesome thing that you did, whether it was actually doing something or giving yourself grace to not do something, and be like, damn, I rock. That's what I want. That's what I want people to do.
Giving yourself grace, too. Yeah. I love that, too, because the next thing I was going to ask is a call to growth, and that's probably the perfect answer for that.
There you go.
So, once again, this is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and Renata Leo on the Polymath podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.